Well, it has been a momentous day in the UK. Boris Johnson has resigned as Conservative Party leader, but he says that he will remain as Prime Minister until a successor is chosen. After 2 days of turmoil and key cabinet resignations, Johnson defiantly refused to leave office. But as those departures piled up and party support disappeared, Johnson at last bowed to the pressure, announcing his decision this morning outside of Number 10. Johnson was keen to set out what he believed to be his key achievements during his time in office.
I'm immensely proud of the achievements of this government, from getting Brexit done to settling our relations with the continent for over half a century, reclaiming the power for this country to make its own laws in Parliament, getting us all through the pandemic, delivering the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, the fastest exit from lockdown, and in the last few months, leading the West in standing up to Putin's aggression in Ukraine.
Well, let's go straight over to London then, where we can bring in our reporter, Vincent McAviney. Vinny, good to see you. After days of speculation, we are finally here. Boris Johnson has said that he's going, but he was definitely reluctant to do so. So what do you think was the deciding factor here for him?
Incredibly reluctant to go, and that's a slightly strange resignation speech. Boris Johnson didn't even acknowledge the reasons that he was being forced out, let alone apologise for them. Very much doing the habit of a lifetime, blaming those around him, saying it was the collective will of the Conservative Party, that it was Darwinist, that they wanted him to go, despite having received this huge mandate that he's kept going on about from voters back in 2019. So he very much was not pinning the blame on himself. It is, though, the fact that this morning, after around 50 members of his government had resigned, it continued at the highest level. He lost his Northern Ireland secretary, his education secretary, who'd only been in the post less than 24 hours. Then the killer blow, Nadeem Zahawi, the man that he'd only just promoted up to Chancellor, the number 2 man in the British government, had threatened to go if he didn't resign. So ultimately, Boris Johnson was not able to have a functioning government. It is believed that his wife, Carrie Johnson, and his close advisor, Guto Hari, his communications advisor, had to have a word with him this morning and say, the jig is up, you have to go. But there are real concerns amongst MPs that the timeline the Prime Minister wants, which would see him staying in office until October. He has he's appointed now members to those empty cabinet spots and not reappointed those who have quit. There's a worry amongst Conservative MPs that the Prime Minister actually might try to reverse this, try and slip out of it somehow, that there could be some kind of crisis involving Ukraine, and that he'll try to stick with it. He said that next week, Boris Johnson, he said he will get the announcement on the timetable for the election to replace him. But it has alarmed Sir John Major, the former Prime Minister of this country, a Conservative in the 1990s, who has written to the 1922 committee, which is the backbench committee which runs the party, saying that the Prime Minister's timeline is simply not acceptable, that he shouldn't be able to make those big decisions we think he wants to make about things like tax policy in the coming months as a lame duck Prime Minister. So I think we might see in the next few days a shifting tide which tries to remove Boris Johnson much quicker than he wants.
So the leadership race is now afoot. Who are the front runners right now?
Well, there are, we think, around 10 candidates who want to run. The current front runners, the current Chancellor, been in the post only almost 2 days, Nadeem Zahawi. He is definitely one to watch. He was the former Education Secretary. He was also in charge of rolling out the vaccine. He has an interesting backstory. He is a refugee from Iraq. You also have the likes of Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, who resigned, starting all of this. Penny Mordaunt, another name. She was Development Minister, someone that's been talked about as well. Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, currently flying back from the G20 in Indonesia. You also get some smaller names like Suella Braverman, the Attorney General. So we are going to get, I think, around 10 initially. 2 people, though, that have ruled themselves out. Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, he says that he will not run. And Michael Gove as well, someone who previously ran for the leadership. He is, of course, fired by Boris Johnson last night, rather unceremoniously. He has said that he will not be running this time around.
All right, our reporter there, Vincent McAviney, bringing us the latest from London. Vinny, good to talk to you on this momentous day. For more analysis on what all of this means and how the next weeks and months unfold, we can bring in Tim Durrant now, who is the Associate Director at the Institute for Government. Good evening to you, Tim. Great to have you with us this evening.
Hi.
I think it's fair to say there are a lot of questions right now. Boris Johnson has indicated he wants to remain until the autumn. The question is, Will his party let him?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, he's set out, he clearly expects to stay as a kind of caretaker prime minister until the next leader of the Conservatives is chosen. We've seen online some MPs saying that they don't think that's good enough. They think he should be gone immediately. But then that opens a whole new set of questions. There needs to be a prime minister. So if you want him to leave straight away, who do you put in his place? In the UK, we don't have a kind of interim or caretaker position. If you are prime minister, you are prime minister. You have all of the powers and responsibilities that go with that post. So it would be untested if they try to put someone in. And the question is as well, who would that be? We have the Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, who has ruled himself out of standing for the leadership. But for him to become any kind of interim Prime Minister, that would require the party to support him. And it's not clear that they're in that place. So yes, there are some people who want Johnson to leave immediately, but actually that makes things a lot more complicated. It seems he is committed to being a kind of hands-off or sort of a more distant, perhaps, Prime Minister in the remainder of his time, so that he can be a more sort of neutral caretaker while the party works out who it wants to take over.
Right.
And I think it's probably more likely.
Tim, I want to ask you this then, because, I mean, you talk about untested options, but essentially we really are in uncharted territory here. And one of the ideas being floated right now is whether the 1922 committee could actually truncate the leadership contest, could speed things along more quickly. I mean, could that be an option, do you think?
Absolutely. So the 1922 committee is the grouping of Conservative backbenchers, and they can set the rules for the leadership contest however they want. They are going to do that next week. I think there is a sense that people want to move quickly. We've got about 3 weeks left before Parliament breaks for summer recess, and so the expectation is that there are 2 stages to the leadership process. The first one is MPs declare, and that list is whistled down to a final 2. And then the second stage, those final 2 are voted on by the members of the party. I think the party wants to resolve that first stage before Parliament breaks for recess, so by the end of July. That's very quick. You know, that we know that there might be a dozen or more candidates running. Lots of names have been bandied around. Lots of people are sort of apparently starting their campaigns for leader. And so the process of getting that big list down to a final 2 is going to take a lot of time.
I mean, you mentioned 3 weeks, you say it's pretty quick, but at the same time, it's a very long time when the UK is going through such a tumultuous period. And I just wonder if there continues to be this tussle, which we could potentially see, is there the risk that there is even more chaos, constitutional crisis for the UK ahead?
There's always that risk, I think. You know, never say never, particularly in the UK over the last few years. At the same time, I actually think we're probably through the worst of the tumult now. I think, you know, the resignations over the last 48 hours, the sense that maybe the Prime Minister was going to try and cling on, that all kind of contributed to this sense of chaos and uncertainty. But actually, now there is at least a roadmap. We know what is going to happen. Yes, of course, things could change. But I think the fact that the Prime Minister set out that, you know, the committee are going to set out the timetable for the election next week, and he's going to stick to that, and then it will be up to them to make that happen as quickly as they want it to. I think that is going to give people some certainty that things are moving as they should.